and here's where my paper begins. And I want to suggest to you 8 factors, right? So the factors that I've summarized flew by right now explain the growth of large law firms, period. But as I've said in my introduction, the large Jewish law firms in New York City after 1945 grew twice as fast as the WASP firms. And what I'm trying to do is explain that unique growth, not the generic growth. I want to share with you 8 factors that I believe explain that remarkable success story of the rise to dominance of the Jewish law firm in New York City. First, size matters. And what I mean by that is, in 1945, the elite corporate bar consists of, relatively speaking, small, large law firms. Right? So when we talk about large law firms in New York in the 1950s, 50 would do, the total number of 50 lawyers does the trick. Not only were the large firms relatively small, but the number of large firms was relatively small. And if you will, the barriers to entry to newcomer firms were, as a consequence, not insurmountable. I'm just telling you to say that Ken suggested that Skadden Arps might be the largest law firm today. I don't think that's the case. There are large law firms with over 3,000 lawyers today. There is an explosion of large law firms, and let me just suggest, David will talk, I think, more about the applications of these factors in other contexts, but let me suggest that if a newcomer law firm, Jewish or otherwise, wanted to emerge in 2006, 50 lawyers would simply not cut it, right? And one office will not do the trick. Okay, so size matters. In other words, it was easier for newcomers coming in 1945 to compete with the existing elite. Second, whereas Mark Galanter's explanation of the tournament of lawyers is celebrated as an account of the engine of growth for law firms, I want to highlight, and I have to consider that I shared it with him before, so I want to highlight a salient feature of his argument. I want to suggest the opposite. The tournament of theory and the Cravath system was a restriction on growth for the WASP firms. In other words, they grew very fast. They could have grown faster and crowd out the newcomers, but they didn't, exactly because of the commitment both to the organizational features of the tournament theory and to Protestant values and visions of professionalism that were embedding white shoe ethos. For example, and I'm talking between 1945 and 1960, no lateral hiring. Now, I'm of course simplifying, very little lateral hiring. Okay? Exclusive recruitment from within the elite law schools. Later on, some of these features are relaxed, and the large WASP firms begin to recruit outside, mostly Harvard, Yale, and Columbia. But initially, again, and the paper goes into much greater detail, the large law firms, the WASP firms between 1945 and 1960, stick to the rules of the game that, in fact, prevent them not from growing, but from growing faster than they did. And the Jewish firms were not restricted by that cultural and religious ethos, and they, in fact, grew faster. So that's 2. 3, protected pockets of Jewish practice. We've heard some references to that before, but many of the large firms in New York City in 1945, all the way to the mid-60s, shied away of certain practice arenas, left them, if you will, to prominent Jewish attorneys. And this is not the simplistic story of Paul D. Cravath and his image of what large corporate lawyers do is corporate law as opposed, for example, to litigation. It is not simply that. It's that whole arenas were vacated initially by the large firms. So we're not just talking about litigation. We're talking about litigation. We're talking about aggressive takeover law and defenses to it, real estate, even immigration law. And it's very interesting to denote that it's not just the Jewish law firms were able to occupy this specialized niche. It's more than that. First of all, those specialized protected arenas provided Jewish law firms with access to the kind of clients that otherwise that they did not represent at the time. And moreover, once certain Jewish law firms established a reputation in the protected, they crossed over and represented the same corporate elite clients in general corporate law, and in arenas that the large elite law firms would not concede. Right? And Joe Flom was mentioned before. One example that I detail in the article is the, if you will, legendary battles between Joe Flom and Marty Lipton of the Wachtell firm. And that, if you will, protected area as late as 1973 of aggressive takeover law allowed both firms, defining, if you will, allowed both firms to grow in a remarkable fashion. All right, so a breather. We talked about size matters, the tournament theories, the restriction on growth, protected Jewish pockets. I want to, the list in my article, I list 8 factors. I want to mention here today only 2 more. In the interest of saving time. First, effective discrimination by the large law firms. I think that Ken is absolutely right. History suggests that there were what I call in the paper token Jewish partners at the elite WASP firms early in the 20th century. Certainly by 1945. But by and large, the WASP firms effectively discriminate against Jewish lawyers. It's highly documented between, at least between, there's the beginning of a change as early as 1945, but the phenomenon is quite robust until the mid-60s. And the resulting effect is an incredible supply of male Jewish attorneys graduating from elite law schools after 1945 and going where? To the Jewish law firms. 5 minutes, that's perfect. Now, it's interesting to note, by the way, that as a side effect of the decline of discrimination, Jewish law firms, beginning in the mid-60s all the way to the 80s, find it relatively harder to recruit because they no longer benefit from ample supply of initially male, later on female Jewish attorneys graduating from elite law schools and coming to them. By the way, again, I don't have time, but I'll just simply add, it wasn't just at the entry level. Even WASP law firms that actually hired Jewish attorneys in the 40s and the early 50s tended not to promote them. So there's this remarkable phenomenon of effective discrimination by the WASP firms, sending ample Jewish associates to the Jewish firms, and WASP firms subsidizing senior associates for the Jewish firms. They train those associates, and when the associates come for promotion, there's the gentle telephone call to your colleague at the Jewish firm, will you take so-and-so? So effective discrimination actually played a role in the remarkable rise of the Jewish law firms. Finally, and perhaps in terms of importance, I find also only a part element, but I kind of avoid the provocation given some of what we've heard in the last 2 days. I call it the flip side of bias. And what is that? Well, we heard a lot about the transformation of ideology. Russ Pierce, I believe it called it in an article, the paradigm shift, right? How the ideology of professionalism changed in the large law firms. It was more waspy, more, we've heard from Sam Levine, based on class, so on and so forth. And here comes Paul D. Cravath initially and talks a lot about merit. And by the time we reach the 21st century, we certainly talk about explicit competition. Well, I mean to suggest that under the old model, the bias against Jewish attorneys, for example, profit maximizers, prevented Jewish lawyers and Jewish law firms from advancing. But under the new model, the explicitly competitive model that Ken talked about, the same bias, the same stereotype, a Jewish attorney will be a profit maximizer, is actually an advantage. It's the flip side of bias. It's the same bias, but the consequences, given the transformation of prevailing ideology at the large firm level, is remarkable for Jewish attorneys and for Jewish firms. And I'll end setting up the stage for my colleague David Wilkins. If you just think about those 8 factors, you might begin to see how when you step outside of our interest in this conference, as in Jews in the legal profession, and begin to think about other minorities, you might begin to see why category-specific law firm or law firms did not come about as on such a grand level as the New York Jewish law firms for other classes and minorities. I dare suggest that if you just think of the flip side of bias factor that I just suggested to you for your consideration, think about the prevailing ideology today and some of the biases and prejudices against other minorities. right? If the bias, for example, and I'll end with that, against a very otherwise competent female attorney is, by the time she reaches her 6th or 7th year, she's going to want to start a family and maybe have children and take care of them. That kind of, there is no flip side to that kind of stereotype. It is as is consistent with the new model of professionalism as it was with the old model of professionalism. And I suggest, just in the conclusion, that the unique combination of the 8 factors that enabled the unique growth of Jewish law firms is unlikely to be repeated in 2006, given the prevailing features of current practice realities. Thank you very much.